Khaled, good to see you, man. I wish it were under a little bit better circumstances, but welcome and thanks for doing this.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. It's good to see you again.
It seems like every day you're posting this really, really insightful stuff. And most of it is from a Palestinian perspective, but it's not from an extremist or without logic or thought behind it. And I've learned an incredible amount from reading the things you post, watching the videos, thinking about the other perspective here. Why is it so important to you? Why are you so passionate about posting this stuff all the time?
Wait, you're not going to ask me if I condemn Hamas? I thought I thought that was the first question. No, I think as you know, why this issue is so important to me. I think there are a couple of reasons. So first, I think it feels like we're on the brink of, if we're not there already, of one of the biggest humanitarian catastrophes of our time, of our lifetime, if not the biggest. So there's that, right? Just at a human level, like seeing, so many children being killed senselessly, the rate of death and the rate of, innocent lives being lost forever, just lives being changed by this conflict. It's just horrific. And I think it really hits different now for me, just being a parent myself. I have a 15-month-old, and so it's just like seeing these videos and images. Every video that I see of a child searching the rubble for her parents, or a father carrying his dead children in his arms, it just really hits different. And so I felt compelled to do whatever I can to, with my privilege, to make this stop. And I obviously only have so much. There's only so much I can do, and so I've tried to be active in conversations with friends and with my community, showing up in protests and things like that. So that's part of it. And then the second, I think, is I was in Jordan actually when the Hamas attacks happened. So I was there with my wife and her family, and so obviously it was very close to home. My wife is Jordanian Palestinian, and so there's a close connection there. I'm not Palestinian, but I'm Syrian, and I've seen what a brutal war has done and can do to my country and to my people. And that civil war was another one of the most epic failures of the international community to step up and do something, and it effectively became a proxy war between East and West. And so just seeing this happen to innocent civilians again, and it feels like it is kind of the Palestinian cause, the struggle is kind of becoming a bit of a proxy war between like Iran and so like it's just really sad. And so seeing this happen again to innocent civilians has really hit a nerve for me. I've been to the West Bank, and I've been to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and I've seen what life, under Israeli military occupation looks like. I've been through checkpoints, and I know how these people live. And I've never been to Gaza, but I can only imagine, what it's like over there. So I feel like I have a pretty good sense of what's going on, and I can speak about it quite well. So yeah, I've just felt obligated to speak up.
Very cool. Yeah. And that perspective is so important. Like having been to the West Bank and your in-laws and all this stuff. Like I hear so many people talking about things that they don't know about. And I think that's something that's really frustrating for me too, is that people are quicker to announce their opinion than they are to learn about their opinion or form their opinion. And I think that's tricky. So I want to get into a little bit of this nuance here. Like a lot of people want to call this Israel versus Hamas or Israel versus Palestine, but the truth is there's a number of different factions and they all have kind of their different angle. Many Israelis do not support Netanyahu, and I would say most Palestinians don't support Hamas. Correct? Why do you think people have such trouble grasping that idea?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think our brains kind of do this automatically, right? I think it's human nature to some extent to just simplify things to be able to understand them more easily. So, the media plays its role and does that too. And I think it really collapses nuance very quickly. And I think it's actually very dangerous. And I think it's kind of this thing that's been done to paint this as like a good versus evil thing, right? Sort of like the war against terror. It's like, it's just not that simple, right? I think many Israelis like you pointed out, they realize that their government is no good for them or for their safety, for their democracy, and for their standing on the world stage. I think Netanyahu and his cabinet of religious zealots have really divided the country. So you're right. Many in Israel don't support them or this war. Um, and I think right now the conflict is really that right wing government against the Palestinian people. And of course, Hamas is being targeted, but really when, millions of civilians, I saw this morning, like 1.6 million have been displaced without any home to go back to because they've been turned to rubble. Tens of thousands killed, at least 30,000 injured. I think it was 12,000 killed as of today. And obviously many more probably buried that we haven't counted yet or that they haven't counted yet. I think it's hard to say that it's like Israel versus Hamas. I think it is very much like is kind of a radical Israeli fascist government. It's definitely not their people by and large against a destitute Palestinian people, and I think most Palestinians, like you said, don't support Hamas. Most Palestinians just want to live a life in peace and dignity and with self-determination, with basic human rights and respect. They don't want to kill all Jews or kill all Israelis, and the same goes for Israelis. Most just want to live in peace and security, and these are just basic human desires. And so there's, if we think about good versus evil, it's not like one side versus the other. It's like I think the people that just desire peace on both sides would be, in my mind, good, and then evil being, the powers that be right now who are really waging war on people.
Yeah. People really have trouble with the idea that Palestinians don't somehow tacitly support Hamas or they're looking the other way or whatever. I guess, how do you see that connection there? Like, are there sons of Palestinians that are Hamas, or how are they being created, I suppose?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I guess I don't think it makes sense to judge people by the most extremist members of their societies, right? So, like, Palestinians aren't represented by Hamas. So just like, I wouldn't judge an average American by Donald Trump. I wouldn't judge, the average Israeli by the Hilltop Youth Settlers or Ben Gvir. Like, the Palestinian people are not represented by Hamas. In fact, most are critical of Hamas, just like many Americans are critical of people in power. But in Gaza, they're afraid to speak up often, right? Like, Hamas kind of rules, with an iron fist in a sense. And but they also don't have any presence in the West Bank, where almost 3 million Palestinians live. So we have to kind of separate. And I did a bit of like a presentation to a bunch of my business school classmates about this, and sort of trying to educate, like, where is Hamas? Where are they not? What is life like without Hamas? All of these things. So I have a pretty decent understanding. Basically, Hamas came to power in the late 80s during the first Intifada. So, and they came to power. They were kind of an offshoot from the Muslim Brotherhood. So they are a group of radical Islamist extremists, and they do call for the destruction of Israel. And they've been clear about that. Like, that's what they want. And so it is strange that they've been propped up for many years by Israel and by Netanyahu in particular. And they did that to counterbalance, and it's well known, I'm not just making this up, but it's known that they basically wanted a counterbalance to the secular PLO, which sort of runs the West Bank, but not really, because it's occupied by Israel, but that's kind of a separate point. And this was, a classic divide and conquer strategy that colonialists have used throughout history, and it obviously ultimately blew up in their face on October 7th. But for the most part, it worked beautifully, and it's made it impossible for a two-state solution, which is actually what the Likud party wants. So this is the party in power in Israel. They want a single state of Israel from the river to the sea. That's what they want. It's in their charter. They say it openly, and it's really no secret. So anyway, back to Hamas. So they seized power following a civil war, really, with their rival Fatah, which is the PLO's armed group. Although Israel generally likes to say that they were elected when Israel withdrew from Gaza back in 2007. They want people to believe that the Palestinians wanted them in power, although Israel claims to be the only democracy in the Middle East, of course, when it comes to this, they claim that Gaza is somehow a democracy too. And I think they do this so that the civilian population can, and it's kind of a sad, in my mind, a sad truth, that the civilian population can bear some responsibility for Hamas's actions, which means they're acceptable collateral damage because they're also evil. And so you can't use the word collective punishment because, they voted this group in power who terrorizes Israelis. Even though half the people killed are children who weren't even alive pre-Hamas. This is kind of a sick game that they've played, and it's a thinly veiled excuse to inflict untold suffering on these people, and I think to also rid the guilty conscience from their people as well, because Israelis don't want to feel that their safety and their security is coming at the expense of innocent civilians, right? So, um,
And
Hamas,
why do you think that's all really interesting? What do you think the ultimate goal of Netanyahu and the sort of extremists there is? It to occupy Gaza and the West Bank, to take it all back? Is that the end goal?
yeah, it seems clear to me and to many, and this is a big fear in the Arab world right now, and obviously with the Palestinians, that this is really the goal of the current, extremist Israeli government to take back the land, or to take the land there, and then eventually the West Bank as well. I mean, that's I think they definitely are making it very difficult to reach a two-state solution. You just look at the map and you can see, the West Bank has become just a bunch of tiny enclaves, and like it would take a lot to get rid of all the settlements and stuff. So they're slowly kind of eating away. The analogy that I've heard used a lot is like you're kind of sitting at a table with a pizza in between you, and while you're negotiating about who's going to take which part of the pizza, one side is just like slowly eating the pizza. That's what's happening. Anyway, I think in Gaza, it seems like they've been making indications that they're basically going to be ethnic cleansing. They're going to take the land. They're going to occupy it for some indeterminate period of time. And I think that's the beginning of the end.
So I think the public facing argument, or the narrative there, is that this, at least Gaza, put the West Bank aside for a second, but that Gaza has been a breeding ground for terrorists, right? And that they have to occupy it long enough to establish security and peace, not only for their own people, but in Gaza. Do you agree with that?
That they need to occupy it?
Well, that they have some responsibility to occupy for security or humanitarian for a period of time. I mean, they're
Yeah.
there now, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, so I think Israel absolutely has a humanitarian responsibility, but they've thrown that out the window. They've violated countless international laws, and they continue to do so on a daily basis, right? They're using starvation as a weapon. There's been evidence of white phosphorus use. They've displaced millions. So before we talk about occupying Gaza, let's talk about a ceasefire, and that needs to happen immediately. And this is just like the foundation of any conversation that I have is just like the killing needs to stop, and there's a clear even that by itself is very controversial. Obviously, a lot of people out there feel like, no, we can't have a ceasefire. We have to get rid of Hamas. So we can talk about that separately, but I think a ceasefire needs to happen, and it needs to happen immediately. And if it doesn't, at the very least, bombing refugee camps and hospitals and UN schools needs to stop, and food and aid and fuel need to be allowed in immediately. People are already dying from starvation. Like this is happening today, and Israel's strategies are very clearly not designed to minimize civilian casualties. In fact, the challenge with so they're sowing the seeds of hatred for generations to come. The next generation of extremists are going to follow in Hamas's wake and are being created today. And I think, so let's say ceasefire happens, whether Hamas is still there or not. Let's say we eradicate Hamas, great, no more Hamas. And some moderate secular leadership takes over power eventually, right? We can give that a name. It's called the West Bank. That is the situation right now, and it's not a pleasant situation. I mean, you can go and ask any Palestinian living there, is this a sustainable solution? It's really not. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's just like life under occupation is not the answer. The only long-term solution is freedom, and that is when I think there's safety for both Palestinians and Israelis will happen when there is freedom on both sides.
I was listening to an interview with Elon, who I don't often agree with, but he was saying, for every Hamas member, if you kill one, but you create a new one, you've really not done anything, right? You've not solved anything.
It's a very logical, Elon type of rational argument, and I think it assumes that Netanyahu doesn't want to create that second, the extremist by killing the first one. And I think that is not necessarily a correct assumption. This is, kind of getting a little conspiracy theory here, but
Sure.
Creating the next generation of extremists, may serve the long-term interests. And I don't know how long Netanyahu is going to remain in government, but I think he's probably convinced himself that this is in the best long-term interest of Israel.
So I think even more simply, people look at this conflict from afar and they say, the Middle East has been fighting over religious wars for tens of thousands of years. What's different today? Or is this just a continuation of Jew, Muslim, Christian wars?
This isn't a religious war. I think that's a common misconception, right? This is not a religious conflict. It never was. Obviously, the Middle East is the birthplace of Abrahamic religions, right? Jesus was a Palestinian, and many of the holiest sites in all of these different religions are in the region. And I've been to some of these places, you can really feel the spiritual energy palpably. It's kind of crazy. And then there's this overlaid tension in the air. But this is not a religious war. It's a war about land. And, previously Jews, Christians, and Muslims were living side by side, mostly in peace, before the Zionist movement really picked up steam in the early 20th century. So, kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, the Zionist movement really picked up steam for good reason, right? Jews were being persecuted, pogroms, it was a shitty situation. And so they found, a lot of them kind of migrated to this part of the world and started forming Zionist militias. And eventually the state of Israel was established after World War II. But this isn't some centuries old, religious conflict. And in fact, many Muslims, Jews, and Christians, particularly the most religious ones, see one another as cousins and see this, what's going on today as abhorrent. So.
Yeah, it was one of the most fascinating things that I learned. I was in Jerusalem last summer, and then I went to the West Bank just for an afternoon, and it was so fascinating. First of all, the best chicken I've ever had in my whole life, but beyond that, the people that I talked to, they were just yeah, our government's fucking us over, and the Israeli government's fucking us over, and we have no options at all. And I also that 2 million Palestinians go into Israel every day to work and come back peacefully and live. I mean, it's really wild when you get on the ground and you talk to these people because they don't actually care about this issue at all.
Yeah.
They just want to go to work and have families and live, right?
Dude,
And
99% of people, if not 99.9 on both sides, just want to live a peaceful life and work and provide for their families and have hopes and dreams. And it's just, yeah, the people in power have different motivations, and that's what it is on both sides.
yeah, and not a good enough system of how to replace them.
Yeah,
right.
And that's quickly. I mean, Israel, to its credit, had more of that, and I think that the current government is dangerously, and this is why people are so up in arms, but they're dangerously kind of eroding the power of the people and starting to really create cause for concern that they're going to really hold on to that power. And and that's super dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of Israelis, they blame Netanyahu and the administration for the failure of defense on October 7th, right? And they blame him for. I just heard today he hasn't given a public interview on TV in Israel since May. He's
Oh
been
wow.
on CNN, he's been on all the Western everywhere, but not speaking to Israelis directly. And I just, that was really illuminating for me. Like, he's doing his own thing.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I didn't hear about that, but I'm
Yeah.
not too surprised. Yeah, I mean, I think he knows that like he'll be he'll be made or broken by his international support. And I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about how like politics within Israel works. I just know I remember Netanyahu was in power when I was in like high school in Dubai, like the late
Yeah.
'90s,
Well,
and early 2000s.
I've read a decent amount of it, and up until a few years ago, it was very similar to the American system, right? With different branches of government. What Netanyahu has systematically tried to do is take more and more executive power. Sound familiar, like in our country, and yeah, I think we're seeing like what that can do, right? These governments are set up to have checks and balances, and if you have one that's ignoring those, you can have some very devastating consequences.
Yeah,
Um, we talked a little bit about how Israel's in a terrible place. I mean, the Palestinians are in a horrific place. They have no options of any kind. Israelis and the Israeli government, they also are in a little bit of a tricky situation because they have to do something. Do you agree that they have to do something? And I know you're not a military strategist, but is it better to go in on foot and do things more targetedly than it is to drop bombs?
yeah. I mean, I think so. I mean, and I read recently an article in Vox about this. It kind of came out maybe like a couple weeks after the Hamas attacks, and it was like, hey, what Israel should do next, and basically none of that is what actually ended up happening. But this writer was advocating for targeted, strategic strikes and like to take out, people and Hamas and leadership, and I think I'm not a military expert. Like, I can't claim to have the answer. And I've, in my uh, conversations with people, like that's often something that comes up. It's like, what would you do if you were in Israel's shoes? I don't know. Like, I just know that this is not the answer. What's happening right now cannot be the answer. The civilized world's answer to what happened on October 7th. I don't know what the answer is. I just know it doesn't have to involve mass starvation. Doesn't seem like that's needed to, get Hamas out of power. It doesn't have to involve, cutting off water and electricity and using 2 nuclear bombs worth of explosives on thousands of buildings. Like, it just seems like there's probably a better way. Obviously, like, maybe that way puts Israeli soldiers' lives more at risk or something. I don't know. Again, I'm not like a
No,
military
that's the
expert.
calculation, right? And then we're saying like, okay, whose life is more important, right? And that's always a tough question to ask. But yeah, I think that's why they do it, right? It's to minimize their own casualties.
Yeah, but it does,
Uh,
that's definitely, there's part of it that I agree with there, but like what's the excuse then for mass starvation? Like how does that, or like preventing fuel from coming in? They say, oh, it'll end up in Hamas's hands. Like, come on, you're one of the strongest militaries in the world. Like, if your enemy has a bit of fuel, like, is it really gonna change the game versus like the value that fuel is gonna provide to, the millions of people there, to keep the hospitals running? Like, that to me seems just really callous, and it's just hard to believe, and to take what the Israeli military has been saying
I think
seriously.
that's well said. They're so outgunned, right?
Yeah,
Like most of the rockets, Iron Dome, et cetera, they don't even hit Israel. So the
yeah,
idea that this fuel is going to make them a really high powered military is just, I mean, they have no
yeah.
Air Force either.
No
Like,
Air
right?
Force,
Like
no
Hamas has no
tanks,
Air Force.
nothing, no
Yeah,
nothing.
yeah. I
Yeah,
guess
so
RPGs. They've got RPGs,
they have
right?
RPGs, yeah, and they have some
Yeah.
anti-tank stuff and AK-47s, yeah, which
Um,
is not on fuel.
one of the things that I've been most critical of in terms of the Israeli response is that they've told the Palestinian people, okay, go south, right? They went south and they start bombing the south. Then they say, okay, well, the Rafah border, right? Try to go to Egypt. We're going to let a certain number of people out into Egypt. Then they bomb the border. So it's this situation where they seem to be asking the right humanitarian questions, right? Okay, how do we avoid this? But then they don't follow their own advice in large capacity.
I'll say I agree. Like, telling people to evacuate, which, by the way, first of all, is not justifiable. It's actually illegal to just say, hey, millions of people go south, and like claiming that that's their humanitarian responsibility to, hey, we dropped these flyers and like everyone so they leave, and then to bomb them, like that's just so sinister. I don't even. And then
Yeah.
now they're actually really ramping up their campaign in the south, where millions of refugees are taking shelter without food or water. It's just unconscionable. And so the sort of forced evacuations are illegal and unjustifiable to begin with. And then, and asking people from hospitals, right, amputees, terminally ill, just to say, hey, like, you're going to have to evacuate because we want to raid because we think Hamas has some tunnel underneath. Like, it's just insanity.
I was also really surprised to find out that even prior to October 7th invasion, whatever, Gaza was getting a tremendous amount of fuel, food, water shipped in every day because they already had a humanitarian problem in Gaza, right? And so I think when they're talking about like, hey, we're sending in all these trucks, it's still a fraction of what was happening before. And that's something I just was not aware of, that it
Yeah,
already was so problematic before.
it was. Yeah. I mean, Gaza's population, like 40% unemployment, 80% of children have some kind of like trauma, and probably now it's like 100%, right? They're traumatized. 80%, I think, have are clinically diagnosed with depression. They have very little water, generally speaking. Like they don't have running water all the time. Even in the West Bank, actually, a friend of mine who also went to Stanford business school, he was a couple years younger than me. He also joined, and like we kind of co-hosted this Zoom session where he was sharing his experience about growing up in the West Bank, and like
Cool.
and this is no Hamas over there. Yeah, this is the West Bank.
Yeah.
Um, he only had access to running water 2 days a week. And so they have these big water tanks on the roofs of their buildings that you'll see if you go around the West Bank. And like that's to store water so that they can have, a shower on days where they don't have running water. Meanwhile, just they can see the settlement very close to where they live that has 24/7 running water. And so controlling the natural resources has long been a game that Israel has played. And in Gaza, it's the same situation. Like they control all the water that goes there, and so they can just shut it off like this, and they can restrict. They actually like even food. Israel sort of apparently ran a study a while ago when they sort of reinforced the blockade after they withdrew in 2007 to figure out how many calories they could send into Gaza or allow into Gaza in order to keep the people there sort of in like a general mode of like malnourishment without dying of starvation. And so it's just a miserable place to live. And I know some people have made the claim to me that like, oh, Israel doesn't actually occupy Gaza anymore. They withdrew in 2007, but like I don't think that's a rational argument that can be made given the situation there.
They're keeping their thumb on them, basically, like,
Yeah.
just keeping them down. Yeah. So, how does that start to change? There's a ceasefire today, and Israel pulls out completely. What are the next steps here? I guess. I mean, yes, there's a huge humanitarian problem, but from a government perspective, I guess, what would you like to see happen? Maybe not what should happen, but what would you like to see happen?
Look, I believe the Jewish people have every right to a safe homeland where they can live without fear of the atrocities that they endured for many years, not only at the hands of the Nazis but other Europeans and Arabs as well, right? But I think in my mind, that doesn't necessitate ethnic cleansing of another people from their homeland. This isn't a zero sum game. We talked about this before, but like, I think there are obviously extremists on both sides, and they want us to believe that this is zero sum. I think the problem right now with Israel's actions are that they're fueling anti-Semitism globally, and I'm not blaming them for anti-Semitism. Like, I don't think that is the reason, but obviously it's on the rise, and
It's
I
having that
think
effect. Yeah.
it's having this effect, and like, and it's, it's making it such that like Israel may eventually be the only safe place, and like, and to me that doesn't seem like a good outcome for Jews around the world, right? Jewish friends of mine are fearing for their safety, and the rise of real anti-Semitism is being drowned out by Israel kind of claiming that any criticism of their actions is anti-Semitic, and I think that that's super dangerous.
Hmm.
So I think like, what's going to happen here? I think with great power comes great responsibility, right? And I think the safety, I think the safety of Jews, Israelis, and Palestinians necessitates that Israel is held accountable for their actions. And in fact, everyone needs to be held accountable there, right? International and humanitarian laws were created following the Holocaust, largely for obvious reasons, and those laws need to be applied on both sides, and those that have committed war crimes need to be held accountable and investigated. And I think that's like accountability is sort of the foundation that's needed on both sides, and then I think once that is in place, then something can be done. But until, as long as like the reckless behavior continues, I find it very difficult to see a solution.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I
I,
don't know.
I think that's really well said. Accountability is needed. I think the question is accountability to whom? Like, you would think maybe in some situations it would be the U.S., and it's kind of a good transition. I want to talk a little bit about kind of the U.S.'s role. Um, they've clearly picked their side. They have long-standing alliances there. The Biden administration is kind of tiptoeing around, sort of, supporting them behind closed doors, but saying some other things in the press. I mean, would it be better that we just weren't involved at all? Because that's kind of how I feel. Is that it's really not our fight either way.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, yeah, that would be great, but it's just impossible. I mean, so the U.S. has, it's like one of the few bipartisan issues that both sides and power like really align on, right? There's not that many, and like this is one of them. But and it's the I think the Israeli like lobbying groups have done such a great job at controlling, Congress, to the point that people can't speak up. You can't even have a conversation about it. It just gets shut down immediately. So there is no world where the U.S. just stops, its unwavering support. I really don't see how that could happen, unless the American people really start sort of waking up and pushing hard. And I think they're starting to. Like, I think in this country we're starting to see the truth and feel like, hey, why are my tax dollars going to support all of this, horrific violence in this place? Like, what am I getting out of it? Why am I not getting healthcare when we're funding, bombs being dropped on civilians? Like, so people are starting to wake up and come out and sort of voice their opinions more than ever before. And I think, the Israeli lobbying groups are scared of that, and they're talking about it openly and like really sort of doing what they can to make sure that they keep their support with the youth. But I think that that's eventually, like, that's the only thing that I could see changing the situation there, because
Hmm.
the U.S. the unwavering U.S. support is just, it gives Israel carte blanche to do whatever they want, and that's just, nothing's going to ever change without the U.S. holding them accountable.
Do you think that they've played any positive role in the sense that there's been reports that, Biden has tried to delay invasions or minimize attacks or whatever? Do you think any of that is true?
No,
No.
I mean, look, I think like, if I say, if I call for restraint, but meanwhile under the table I'm handing you a gun, like that, like your actions are going to speak much louder than your words. And like, I think the U.S. is seeing public opinion shifting, and so they're like, oh shit, we have to say something. So let's just call for restraint. Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, okay,
Mhm.
let's go fund them $14 billion and let them continue with this. Like, if you want to call for restraint, like make your aid conditional, maybe, right?
Mhm.
But like doing things unconditionally is just never going to cause any kind of change. I mean, from what I've heard recently, like there was some fuel allowed in after pressure from the U.S.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's going to be some limited amount of fuel coming in daily. Definitely not enough, and we'll keep people on their knees.
Yeah. Um, well, this has been great, man. I certainly have learned a lot, and I always learn a lot from reading your stuff, like I said. And thanks for coming on and having a calm, civilized debate about it. I think that's really difficult for a lot of people today. But yeah, man, I hope for better times than the Middle East because it's an amazing place, and I've had great times there. And the food and the culture and the people are just unlike anywhere else. And it's just really unfortunate that this is the way modern Middle East is today. Yeah.
It really is, man. Yeah, and I appreciate that. I appreciate you reaching out and asking me to have this conversation. I enjoyed the conversation, and yeah, wish hope for change and in the very near future. I think there's just
Hope
like
for peace, right? I mean,
yeah,
I think like aside from the extremists, we all do want peace. We see it differently. We see it the solution differently, maybe, but at the end of the day, we do want the same thing, and we have to remember that.
yeah, we do, and we have to remember that like one side's trauma doesn't negate the others, right? There's such deep trauma on both sides that's going to take a lot of healing over many generations to resolve. But I think a good starting point is appreciation for one another's basic humanity, basic dignity. Recognize that this isn't like a good versus evil. These are human beings on both sides. Like let's start there and then build up from there.